On their wedding day, Emma's veil trailed across the snow as Daniel led her into the forest for one last photo before the reception. They thought the woods would give them quiet beauty, a memory framed in white pines. But just beyond the path, the silence cracked, a faint, broken bark, like a plea swallowed by the cold. Following the sound, they found not a fairy tale backdrop, but a nightmare. A German shepherd chained to a tree, starving, bleeding, and abandoned. What they did next would turn their wedding into something far greater than vows or rings. This is a story of love tested, of secrets unearthed, and of a dog who carried a miracle into a bride and groom's hands. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. The mountain town of Silver Pines lay beneath a sky the color of iron, its rooftops buried under weeks of relentless snow. Winter had settled in early, biting deeper than the years before, and every corner of the town bore its scars. Wooden fences sagged under ice, chimneys bled smoke into the frozen air, and the roads, thin, winding veins stretching toward the forest, gleamed with frost so sharp it seemed to whisper warnings beneath the tires of any passing car. Pines stood shoulder to shoulder along the ridges, their tall frames bowed under the weight of snow, branches creaking like old doors in the wind. The air carried the smell of resin, wood smoke, and something colder, something metallic that only came when the mountains tightened their grip. It was into this quiet, austere landscape that a cream-colored pickup truck hummed softly along a road, flanked by towering trees. Inside the cab, warmth misted the windows, and laughter rose and fell like breath in a sanctuary. Emma Whitlow sat in the passenger seat, her wedding dress bundled carefully around her, the ivory fabric cascading like a waterfall of silk across the seat. She was 27, tall and graceful, with a slender build that lent her the elegance of a figure carved in marble. Her skin was a soft olive tone, warmed now by the pink flush of cold against her cheeks. Her hair, chestnut brown and glossy, was arranged in a low bun at the nape of her neck, though loose curls had rebelled, brushing her jawline and catching stray snowflakes when she had stepped outside earlier. A faint scatter of freckles decorated the bridge of her nose, and her hazel eyes carried the dual fire of joy and curiosity. Emma's personality was steady and kind, known in town for her work as an art teacher at the elementary school. She had a gift for listening, for coaxing shy children into painting the world as they saw it, for laughing easily but never cruelly. Life had not broken her softness, but it had deepened her resilience, marked in small ways, like the scar across her wrist from a kiln accident years before, which she sometimes touched unconsciously when she was lost in thought. Today, however, she looked every part a bride. Luminous, trembling with anticipation, and slightly breathless from the enormity of a day that carried both the weight of promises and the lightness of celebration. At the wheel was her new husband, Daniel Rourke, 30 years old and built with the sturdy ease of a man accustomed to labor. His shoulders strained slightly against the fabric of his suit jacket, a garment that seemed ill-suited for someone whose hands were more often calloused by tools than smoothed by ceremony. He had storm-gray eyes set beneath dark brows, a jaw square and perpetually shadowed with stubble, and hair cut close at the sides but curling at the crown, in a way Emma loved to tease him about. A pale scar cut across his chin, the memory of a rescue mission in a snowstorm when a branch had struck. Him, one of many reminders that life in the mountains demanded both courage and sacrifice. Daniel had a reputation in Silver Pines for building things that endured. Furniture crafted with precision, homes repaired with care, promises kept without flourish, but with unwavering reliability. He carried with him a quiet gravity born of loss, His best friend Aaron had died the winter before on black ice, and though Daniel's laughter still came, it was tempered now, colored by grief. It made his kindness more deliberate, his patience more enduring. Today, as he drove, he glanced at Emma and smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting into something rare and unguarded. They were on their way to the lodge, where family and friends awaited with music, cider, and lights strung against the dark. But Emma had asked for one thing: a stop in the forest for photographs before the reception. She wanted to stand among the pines, to let the snow catch in her veil, to carry into memory the image of love set against the stern beauty of the wilderness. Daniel had agreed with little hesitation. To him, marriage meant honoring not only great vows spoken before a crowd, but the smaller wishes whispered in passing. He turned the truck down a service road, tires crunching over the frozen gravel, and parked near a gap where the forest opened its arms. They stepped out into the cold. Emma gathered her skirt, silk brushing against snow, her veil floating behind her like a ghost of lace. Daniel moved around the hood to join her, adjusting her veil so it fell properly across her shoulders, then kissed her forehead with lips already stung red by the cold. The world seemed hushed, the forest watching, the pines bowing in solemn witness. They stood for a moment in silence, marveling at the stillness, until the stillness fractured. It came faint at first, almost mistaken for the groan of an old branch under the weight of ice. A sound, thin and ragged, a bark stripped of strength, followed by a whine that faltered into silence. Emma stiffened, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Daniel's head snapped toward the trees, his eyes narrowing. The sound came again, closer this time, though weak and broken, a plea rather than a call. It was not the wild cry of coyote or fox, it was something else, something domestic, familiar, and desperate. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice low, as if afraid of breaking the moment. Daniel nodded. "There," he said, pointing toward a darker tangle of trees, where the snow seemed deeper and the silence thicker. Emma hesitated, her dress clumsy against the roots and snow, but then lifted her skirts and followed as Daniel led the way. They moved slowly, weaving between the pines, their boots crunching softly. The forest closed around them, muffling the outside world until the only sounds were their breaths and the faint, broken whine that tugged them forward. The tracks appeared first. Paw prints, large and heavy, staggered as though made by an animal struggling. The snow inside the prints was stained faintly, dark against white. Daniel crouched to study them, his brows knitting. "Dog," he murmured. "Big one." Emma's heart hammered. They pressed deeper, following the trail, until the trees opened into a small hollow where a pine had split under storm weight, half its trunk leaning into the snow. There, chained at the base of its scarred trunk, lay the source of the sound. A German shepherd, large but wasted, his once muscular body collapsed into ribs and bones beneath matted fur. The black and tan coat, once proud, was filthy and tangled, streaked with blood. One ear drooped torn and raw, the other half standing as though habit alone kept it alert. Snow clung to his muzzle, his breaths shallow clouds that barely stirred the air. Around his neck and chest, a heavy iron chain looped twice, biting deep into his flesh, leaving raw wounds scabbed and frozen. His amber eyes lifted weakly to meet theirs, clouded with pain but strangely calm, as though some fragment of dignity still clung to him despite his suffering. He did not bark again. He had no strength left. Emma pressed a hand to her mouth, her hazel eyes wide with horror. Daniel stood frozen, storm-gray eyes locked on the sight, anger and sorrow written across his face. The German shepherd lay trembling in the snow, chained and forgotten, the sound of his breath the only proof that life had not yet abandoned him. And in that moment, what should have been a day of photographs and laughter shifted. Their wedding day, marked by joy and celebration, suddenly stood at the edge of something heavier, something unexpected. What began as a search for beauty had led instead to a discovery that would change everything. Daniel crouched low in the hollow of the tree, the breath from his lungs fogging the air in uneven bursts as he studied the cruel iron that bound the animal. The chain was old, its surface rough with rust, links thick and unforgiving, looped twice around the trunk, and driven into the frozen earth with a stake hammered flat by force. He dug his gloved fingers against the links, testing them, pulling once, twice, but they did not yield. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath the rough line of stubble that shaded his face. Years of carpentry had given him strength in his arms and patience in his work, but there was no subtle craft that could break steel bare-handed. He pressed his palm against the chain one last time, feeling the cold bite through his glove, then cursed under his breath. "It's wedged too deep," he muttered, storm-gray eyes scanning the snow for any tool, though the forest offered nothing. Behind him, Emma had dropped to her knees, her dress spreading in a pale arc around her like a fallen petal. She was shivering now, her cheeks flushed from cold, strands of chestnut hair clinging damp to her temples. Yet she moved with steady hands, unfastening the veil that still clung to her shoulders. It was delicate, sheer lace edged with embroidery, meant to catch light and laughter in photographs, not snow and blood. Without hesitation, she folded it over and placed it gently across the German shepherd's body. The fabric covered his ribs and chest, a fragile cocoon against the cold. Emma's hazel eyes softened, brimming with both sorrow and resolve as she whispered, "You're not alone anymore." The dog shifted faintly under the touch, his sides trembling with shallow breaths. He was a German shepherd of impressive build even in his wasted state, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, the prime of his working life stolen by neglect. His once proud coat of black and tan was clumped and filthy, and his body sagged from weeks of starvation, but strength still lingered in the set of his shoulders. His amber eyes lifted to Emma's face, and though dulled by exhaustion, they held a spark of something stubborn. Trust that had not yet died. Daniel moved closer again, testing the stake buried in the soil, his hands brushing frost from the base of the trunk. He tried to rock it, to wrench it loose, but the metal was frozen into place, immovable without tools. His breath hissed in frustration. "We'll have to bring him as he is," he said finally. Emma looked up, her lips parting as though to protest, but then nodded. She slid her hands under the veil to steady the dog's trembling chest, her slender arms tense with effort. "Then we don't wait," she replied firmly, her voice stripped of doubt. Daniel removed his jacket, broad shoulders left bare to the cold in his white shirt, and wrapped it around the shepherd's body, shielding him as best he could. The dog sagged into the warmth, his head dropping heavily against Daniel's arm. Gathering the slack of chain so it would not drag, Daniel slid his arms beneath the shepherd's frame. He lifted, grunting softly, and felt the full weight of the animal. Heavy still despite his wasted muscles, his ribs pressing sharp into Daniel's chest. For a moment the dog stiffened, instinct flashing through worn nerves. Then he relaxed, surrendering to Daniel's grip. Emma hurried beside them, her gown clumsy against the snow, but she gathered the trailing fabric in one hand and steadied Daniel with the other as they moved toward the truck. The forest seemed to press closer as they went, branches whispering in the wind, but no further sound rose from the trees. Their boots crunched rhythmically over the frost-bitten ground until the cream-colored pickup came into view, its windows already fogging from the cold waiting inside. Daniel opened the rear door with his free hand and laid the shepherd gently across a folded blanket Emma had spread over the seat earlier. The chain clattered dully against the metal floor, and the dog flinched before going still again. Emma climbed in beside him, her veil still wrapped around his torso, her small hands stroking the coarse fur with deliberate gentleness. Daniel closed the door, circling to the driver's side, his breath rising in heavy clouds. When he slid into the seat and turned the ignition, the truck shuddered, then roared to life, warm air beginning to hum faintly through the vents. The heater groaned, fighting against the cold. Emma leaned over the dog, whispering, her hazel eyes fixed on his weary face. "Stay with us, boy," she murmured. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled faintly against his fur. The shepherd stirred weakly, his head shifting. Then, as the truck began to roll forward, he lifted it with effort and pressed it into Emma's lap. His body was heavy against her legs, but she did not move, only placed her hand gently on his skull. His eyes closed, but in their amber depths, before the lids shuttered, there was no fear, only a weary trust, the spark of belief that life might still offer kindness. Emma felt tears burn hot against the cold on her cheeks. She pressed her other hand against Daniel's arm, and when he glanced toward her, she whispered, "He believes in us." Daniel's gray eyes flickered in the rearview mirror, resting on the gaunt figure sprawled across the blanket. His jaw set, his hand steady on the wheel as he steered them back toward the road. "Then we make sure he's right," he said simply. Snow feathered across the windshield as the truck rolled forward into the white silence. In the back seat, wrapped in lace and cloth, the German shepherd exhaled, his head heavy in Emma's lap, carried toward a future neither bride nor groom had imagined when the day began. The lodge stood at the edge of silver pines, a wide wooden structure with walls of cedar and windows that glowed with the soft gold of lanterns. Snow had gathered thick on the roof, weighing it down like a heavy blanket, and the surrounding pines pressed close, their branches swaying gently as if guarding the place from the silence of the mountains. Inside, laughter and music drifted faintly, but outside in the parking lot the world was hushed, broken only by the low rumble of Daniel's truck as it pulled into place. Emma sat in the back seat, her veil wrapped tightly around the German shepherd. The dog's breathing was shallow, his head still resting in her lap, but his amber eyes opened from time to time, fixing on her face as though committing it to memory. Daniel shut off the engine and quickly got out, opening the rear door. The cold wind cut sharp across his jaw, but he ignored it. With careful strength, he lifted the shepherd again, his broad arms steady under the animal's weight. Emma followed close behind, holding up her gown and guiding him toward the side entrance of the lodge, away from the curious eyes waiting in the main hall. The side door opened into a utility corridor, its air warmer but smelling faintly of pine cleaner and smoke from the nearby kitchen. Standing in the hallway was Clara Jensen, the innkeeper's daughter who often helped with events. Clara was in her mid-30s, petite and round-faced, with a crown of curly blonde hair pulled back into a loose braid. Her skin was pale, dotted with freckles across her nose, and her bright green eyes were always alert, curious, sometimes too curious for her own good. She was known in town as someone cheerful, quick to gossip, but never unkind. Tonight she wore a thick wool sweater in red, sleeves pushed to her elbows as if she had been working hard since dawn. When she saw Daniel and Emma carrying the dog, her mouth opened in surprise. "What on earth?" she began. Emma cut her off gently, her voice urgent. "Clara, please, not a word to anyone yet. He needs warmth, quiet, and water." Clara blinked once, then nodded quickly, her nature too compassionate to argue. "Come," she said, gesturing them into a small storage room at the back, where stacks of linens and crates of firewood were kept. The room was plain but private, its air warmer thanks to a vent rattling softly in the corner. Daniel lowered the shepherd carefully onto a folded quilt. Emma knelt beside him at once, her hands brushing back his matted fur, her hazel eyes filled with worry. Clara slipped away to fetch a bowl of water and a towel, without asking further questions. Daniel crouched on one knee, his broad hands moving with the careful precision of a man used to repair work. He inspected the dog's body for wounds. Along the ribs, he found raw patches where the chain had rubbed skin to the flesh, and one ear was torn badly, dried blood crusted into the fur. He pulled his pocket knife, its blade worn, but sharp, and gently began trimming away some of the clumps of fur to better see the damage. Emma stroked the shepherd's neck to soothe him, whispering quietly, her voice steady but tender. The dog responded faintly, his tail twitching once against the quilt. Clara returned, her steps soft, carrying a bowl of water and a rag. She knelt, handing them to Emma, her green eyes wide with sympathy. "Poor thing," she murmured. "How long was he out there?" "Too long," Daniel replied, his voice grim. He dipped the rag in water and pressed it gently against the raw skin at the dog's neck. The shepherd flinched slightly but did not resist, his eyes fixed on Daniel as if understanding the intent. As Daniel worked, his fingers brushed something hard beneath the fur at the base of the dog's neck. At first he thought it a burr or a piece of the chain, but when he parted the matted hair further, he saw the glint of metal. His brows drew together. "Emma," he said softly. She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. With care, Daniel used the knife to cut away more of the tangled fur until a small rectangular tag came into view, attached to a thin length of worn leather that had slipped beneath the heavier chain. The tag was scarred and dull, its surface scratched by time and weather, but letters were still faintly visible. Daniel wiped it with the wet rag, revealing the engraving. K9, Sergeant Echo. For a moment silence filled the room, heavier than the snow outside. Emma's breath caught, her hazel eyes widening. She pressed a hand against her lips. "Sergeant," she whispered, the word trembling. Clara frowned, confused. "What does it mean?" Daniel's storm-gray eyes lifted, and there was something new in them, a recognition that what lay before them was no ordinary stray. "It means," he said slowly, "this isn't just a dog. He was military." Emma stared at the shepherd, her heart pounding. Suddenly the scars, the discipline in his stillness, the dignity in his eyes all made sense. This was not an abandoned pet. This was a soldier, trained, once respected, now discarded in chains like garbage. She reached out, her hand resting on his head. "How could anyone leave him like that?" Daniel shook his head, his jaw tightening. His past experience with loss sharpened his anger now. "A dog like this doesn't end up in the woods by accident. Someone wanted him forgotten." Clara, still kneeling nearby, bit her lip, clearly unsettled. She had grown up in Silver Pines and heard plenty of tales about military units training in the mountains years before, but none had ever ended like this. "Echo," Emma whispered, tasting the name. The shepherd's ear twitched faintly at the sound, and his amber eyes opened, catching hers. For an instant there was something unmistakable. Recognition. Faint, but real. Emma gasped softly, her chest tightening. Daniel's hand rested heavy on her shoulder. He looked down at the tag again. Then, at the dog, and his voice dropped low. "If he's Sergeant Echo, then he's been through things most of us can't imagine. and someone out there knew enough to chain him up and walk away. The room seemed smaller then, the warmth of the vent suddenly insufficient against the weight of the mystery pressing in. Emma's hazel eyes darkened with resolve. Then we can't just treat him like a stray. We have to find out who he was, and why he was left behind. The shepherd exhaled heavily, as if relieved to have been seen not just as broken, but as someone, something, with a history. His head dropped again to the quilt, but his eyes stayed open, watching them with the patience of a soldier who had waited too long for rescue. And in that dim storage room, amid the smell of wet fur and wood smoke, the truth settled over them like snow. Their wedding day had given them not just vows, but a mystery. Night pressed down heavy over Silver Pines, muffling the town in silence, save for the occasional groan of ice shifting on rooftops. The wedding lodge, now hushed after laughter and music had faded, stood solitary in the snow, its lanterns glowing faintly against the dark pines. Daniel and Emma had retreated to the private storage room, where Sergeant Echo lay curled on folded quilts, his ribs still sharp beneath his battered coat, but his breaths stronger than earlier. Emma sat cross-legged beside him, her wedding dress exchanged for a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The glow of a single lantern lit her hazel eyes, casting them in soft amber as she traced the letters on the metal tag again. K9. Sergeant Echo. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the gravity of it. Daniel leaned against the wall near the door, his broad shoulders hunched, his storm-gray eyes staring out through the small window that opened toward the forest. His mind worked restlessly, shaped by years of building and repairing, always assessing weaknesses, always searching for what might come next. His face, hard-edged with stubble, looked older under the shadows, worn by responsibility heavier than the day had promised. Echo stirred suddenly, his ears twitching. A low growl built in his throat, guttural and tense. Emma leaned forward at once, alarm sparking in her chest. "What is it?" she whispered. Daniel straightened, crossing to the window. Outside, the snow glimmered faintly under a half-hidden moon. The pines swayed in a slow rhythm, but between them he thought he saw movement, shadows where there should have been none. He opened the door quietly, stepping out into the brittle night air. His boots crunched softly against the packed snow as he scanned the ground. There, illuminated by the lantern glow spilling from the window, he saw them. Footprints, heavy and unfamiliar, circling the lodge at a distance. They did not belong to guests, whose shoes would have trailed toward the main hall. These prints lingered at the edges, weaving where no reason for wandering existed. Daniel crouched low, his hand brushing across the impressions. The edges were crisp, recent. Whoever had been there was watching. A cold certainty settled in his chest. He rose, jaw tight, and turned back inside. Emma had been watching anxiously from the doorway, the blanket clutched tighter around her. "There's someone out there," Daniel said quietly, his tone sharp with controlled anger. "They're circling the lodge." Echo growled again, his amber eyes fixed on the same window as though he could see through the glass. Emma shivered, not from the cold, but from the feeling of being hunted. She moved closer to the shepherd, stroking the rough fur at his neck, her hand brushing against something coarse tangled beneath. She frowned and tugged gently. It was a small pouch, made of frayed rope, knotted and hidden against his collar. She glanced up at Daniel, who crossed, quickly to her side. With careful fingers she worked the knot loose, and drew out what was inside, a folded piece of paper, edges worn, the fibers stiff from damp and age. She opened it slowly, flattening it under the lantern light. It was a map, hand-drawn, the outlines of the surrounding forest sketched in dark strokes. Trails and ridges were marked, familiar paths winding through the Rockies. But at the center was something unusual, a symbol drawn in red ink, a crude X circled twice, positioned far north of the main ranger routes. Emma's hazel eyes widened, her breath catching. "Daniel, what is this?" He studied the lines, his jaw clenched. "It's a landmark," he said, "and someone wanted to make sure Echo carried it." He glanced at the dog, whose ears twitched as if he understood the weight of the discovery. Emma's fingers trembled against the page. So he wasn't just abandoned. He was carrying this. He witnessed something, or someone wanted him silenced with it. Daniel's storm-gray eyes darkened further. His mind went to the footprints outside, the shadows in the trees, the chain that had been hammered into the earth. None of this was chance. Emma sat back on her heels, the map still clutched in her hand. Her face, framed by chestnut curls now loose from her bun, looked pale but resolute. She was not simply the bride who had asked for photographs in the snow. She was a woman staring into something dangerous and unknown. Daniel reached down, resting his rough hand gently on her shoulder. "Whatever he saw," he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "We'll find out. But we're not alone in this." Echo lifted his head then, pressing his muzzle lightly against Emma's arm, the touch both weary and deliberate. In his amber eyes glowed the shadow of memory, a soldier's witness to something terrible in the woods. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint crack of branches, too deliberate to be nature alone. Someone was still watching. Morning came grudgingly to Silver Pines, the pale light of dawn spreading across the valley in hesitant strokes, casting long shadows from the snow-burdened trees. The lodge was quieter now, the echoes of celebration replaced by a solemn stillness. Daniel and Emma had not slept well. The weight of the footprints outside, the hidden map, and the dog's unspoken history pressed too heavy on their minds. Echo, Sergeant Echo, as the tag had named him, lay curled on the blanket, his amber eyes following every movement though his body remained weak. He was improving under warmth and water, but something in his gaze said restlessness, as though unfinished duty pulled at him. Daniel had suggested seeking someone who might understand the significance of what they had found. And there was only one man in Silver Pines who fit that role. Harris Claiborne. Harris was a figure known to everyone in town, a man in his late 70s who carried himself with the rigid bearing of a soldier even after decades of retirement. Tall, though slightly stooped with age, his body still carried the memory of strength in his broad frame and long arms. His hair, once black, was now entirely white and kept cropped short, and a neatly trimmed beard lined his angular jaw, lending him a severe appearance, softened only by his pale blue eyes. Those eyes, however, often seemed distant, focused on memories most would rather forget. Harris had served in the Army during conflicts overseas and later worked in specialized forestry security units, experiences that had carved lines deep into his weathered face. Some said he had seen too much. Others whispered that he had chosen isolation deliberately. He lived on the edge of town in a log cabin he built himself, preferring solitude, his company more often the trees than people. Yet for those who approached him with respect, he shared knowledge generously, particularly about the woods, their dangers, and the darker chapters of Silver Pines history. Emma wrapped herself in a thick coat, her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders, while Daniel drove the truck slowly along the icy road toward Harris's cabin. Echo lay in the back, his body steadier now, head lifted enough to watch the passing trees. Emma occasionally reached back to rest her hand on his fur, offering reassurance more for herself than the dog. They arrived mid-morning. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, its roof layered with frost, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. The air smelled of pine and wood ash. Harris was outside, splitting firewood, his movements deliberate despite his age. He wore a heavy flannel jacket over worn jeans, thick gloves covering his large hands. His shoulders were broad but slightly bent, his posture marked by decades of labor. When he heard the crunch of tires, he looked up, his pale blue eyes narrowing against the glare of snow. Daniel stepped out first, Emma following with Echo carefully guided beside her. Harris set down his axe, leaning on it as they approached. His voice was gravelly, carrying both authority and fatigue. "Rourke," he said with a nod, recognizing Daniel. His gaze moved to Emma, softening slightly, then dropped to the shepherd. At once his eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned." Emma's brows knit. "You know him?" Harris moved closer, crouching with surprising ease for his age. He reached out, not to touch at first, but to see if the dog would react. Echo lifted his head, sniffed, then allowed the man's hand to rest gently against his scarred neck. Harris's weathered face grew stern. "I'd know those markings anywhere. This isn't just any shepherd. This is Kodiak." Emma blinked. "Kodiak?" Harris nodded, standing slowly, his hand lingering in the air as though reluctant to leave the dog. That was his unit name, K9 Sergeant Kodiak. He served with a covert forestry security unit years back, specialized in tracking and intercepting illegal operations in these mountains. The Ironwood Collective, they called the enemy back then. A network of smugglers and loggers cutting through restricted land, selling timber on black markets, and willing to kill anyone who got in their way. Kodiak was one of the best trained, saved more than one life in ambushes. Daniel's storm-gray eyes narrowed. But his tag said Echo. Harris exhaled slowly, nodding. Echo was the designation of his unit. Each dog had a call sign, and Kodiak was his. He was reported missing nearly 5 years ago, during a raid north of the ridge. Some said he was killed, others that he ran off in the chaos. Officially, they wrote him off as lost in action. But I never believed that. He was too disciplined to vanish. Emma's hazel eyes widened, her hand tightening on the map she still carried in her coat. So someone chained him in the woods all this time? Harris's gaze darkened. Someone didn't want him found. And now that he's back, alive, it means the truth of what happened that night might crawl back into daylight. He stepped closer, his pale eyes locking on Daniel's. The Ironwood Collective was never truly gone. They went quiet, hid their faces, but they're still out there. And the fact that you found Kodiak means they're nervous. Nervous enough to circle your lodge? Nervous enough to want this dog silenced. Echo gave a low growl then, as if confirming the words, his amber eyes catching the light of the snow. Emma knelt beside him, her voice trembling but steady. He's not just a dog left to die, he's a witness. Harris placed a heavy hand on Daniel's shoulder, his grip firm despite the years. Be careful. You've stepped into something bigger than you know. If Kodiak survived, it's because he had something worth protecting. And if the collective suspects you've seen even a piece of it, they won't stop. The wind shifted then, rattling the branches overhead, carrying with it the sense of a forest holding secrets still buried. And in that moment, both Emma and Daniel knew their lives had been tethered not just to vows of marriage, but to the fate of a soldier on 4 legs, and the shadows of a conspiracy still alive in the pines. The lodge was alive again that evening, though in a softer way than the chaos of the wedding feast earlier. Friends and townsfolk filled the hall, their laughter weaving through the music of a fiddler in the corner. Candles burned on every table, casting flickering light across the wooden walls. Emma, now in a simpler dress borrowed from Clara, her wedding gown safely folded away, moved through the room with grace, her chestnut hair falling loose around her shoulders. Her hazel eyes sparkled when she laughed, though a heaviness lingered beneath the glow, a weight she carried after the revelations of the day. Daniel stood near the hearth, his broad shoulders squared, storm-gray eyes scanning the room more often than they lingered on conversation. He wore his suit jacket open, his shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms, and his posture carried both the ease of a groom among friends and the tension of a man expecting trouble. Kodiak lay near their table, his body still lean but his chest fuller, breaths deeper. Wrapped in a navy blanket, the German shepherd's amber eyes swept the hall, always alert, always listening. Some guests stopped to pet him, charmed by his quiet dignity, but the dog's gaze remained fixed on entrances, his soldier's instincts never resting. It was then that a stranger arrived. The door creaked open, letting in a rush of cold air and snowflakes. A man stepped inside, tall and wiry, wrapped in a dark wool coat that brushed his knees. A black scarf wound tightly around his neck and chin, concealing the lower half of his face. His hair, slick and dark, clung to his forehead, and his eyes, narrow, calculating, the color of slate, swept the room with quick precision before softening into a smile that did not reach them. He carried himself with the confidence of someone used to entering unfamiliar rooms and owning them within moments. When he spoke, his voice was smooth but clipped. "Evening," he said, nodding to a few locals. "Name's Morgan Vance. Forestry Service. Passing through, thought I'd pay respects." His words carried authority, but his badge, shown briefly, looked too new, the leather case too stiff. Some nodded politely, others returned to their conversations, but Daniel's eyes did not leave the man. Morgan Vance was in his early 40s, lean but coiled with energy, his clean-shaven face cut sharp at the cheekbones. A faint scar traced the line of his jaw, the kind earned not from work but from conflict. His gloved hands flexed often, as though restless. He claimed the air of a government official, but Daniel, who had learned to read men from years of hard labor and the memory of friends lost to reckless trust, felt the wrongness immediately. Vance's gaze landed on Kodiak. For a moment the mask slipped, his narrow eyes sharpened, pupils contracting. Emma noticed, too, her breath catching as she reached for Daniel's arm. The dog stiffened, his ears rising, a growl low in his throat. Daniel stepped forward, his storm-gray eyes hard. "Forestry Service doesn't usually attend weddings," he said quietly, voice even but edged. Vance's smile broadened just enough to be false. "Small towns. Word travels. Thought I'd stop by." He did not move closer, but his eyes never left Kodiak. The evening strained under the weight of his presence. Eventually he drifted to the back, making light conversation with townsfolk, but Daniel caught the way his hand brushed the black scarf often, the way his body angled always toward the shepherd. Hours later, when the last guests departed into the snowy night, Emma and Daniel retired to their room at the lodge, Kodiak curled at their door. The hallways had gone quiet, lanterns dimmed. The storm outside whispered against the windows. It was past midnight when the disturbance came. Kodiak's growl split the silence, low, guttural, teeth bared. Emma startled awake, her chestnut hair tangled across her face. Daniel rose immediately, pulling on his boots, his storm-gray eyes flashing toward the door. The handle turned. The door creaked open an inch, then another. Daniel lunged, yanking it wide. There stood Morgan Vance, the black scarf still around his neck, his eyes narrowed with intent. In his hand was a leash loop, thick and worn, aimed directly for Kodiak. The shepherd exploded into motion, his strength returned in a sudden surge. With a powerful leap, he lunged past Daniel, amber eyes blazing, body a blur of black and tan. He struck Vance squarely, teeth snapping inches from the man's arm, driving him backward into the wall. Vance cursed, struggling, but the dog's body weight and fury pinned him. Daniel seized Vance's wrist, wrenching it behind his back as Emma cried out for help. The commotion drew others. Ben Carver, a close friend of Daniel's, arrived first. Ben was a broad man in his late 20s, with a square jaw hidden beneath a trimmed beard and hands calloused from years at the town's sawmill. He was known for his easy humor and his loyalty, though tragedy lingered in him too. His younger brother had vanished in the woods years earlier, fueling a protective streak that often made him quick to defend. He rushed forward, his dark eyes flashing, helping Daniel restrain the stranger. Within moments, more hands joined. 2 neighbors from town who had lingered after the wedding, their faces pale with shock, but their arms firm. Together they forced Vance to the ground, Kodiak still snarling until Daniel commanded sharply, "Down." The dog obeyed, stepping back but keeping his eyes locked on the man. Emma, breathing hard, snatched at the coat Vance wore. Papers spilled across the floor, a small black device with a cracked lens, clearly a hidden camera, and a folder of documents with forestry stamps that on closer inspection looked clumsy, forged. Daniel held one up, his jaw set. "Not forestry," he said flatly. Vance said nothing, his narrow eyes burning with quiet rage. Ben leaned down, his voice rough with disbelief. "What the hell were you planning? Taking him?" No answer came. But in the silence, the truth already felt clear. This was no accident, no coincidence. Kodiak had been hunted, his survival a threat to those who wanted him forgotten. And tonight, under the roof of their wedding lodge, Daniel and Emma had seen the shadows of that conspiracy walk through their door. The morning after the confrontation arrived with a brittle clarity, sunlight piercing through the frosted windows of the lodge. Snow lay thick across the grounds, sparkling under the pale sky, but inside the air carried tension rather than celebration. Morgan Vance sat bound to a chair in one of the side rooms, his scarf discarded, his slate-colored eyes burning with defiance. The forged documents and broken camera lay on the table beside him, grim reminders of the shadows Daniel and Emma had stumbled into. Daniel, jaw tight, stood watch near the door, while Emma kept close to Kodiak, who rested at her feet, head lifted, amber eyes sharp. The shepherd no longer looked like the half-dead creature chained in the woods. Though still gaunt, his posture had shifted, chest rising strong, ears alert, the soldier within him alive again. It wasn't long before the town sheriff arrived. Sheriff Mason Carter was a man in his early 50s, tall and broad, with the kind of rugged face carved by years of service. His hair, once sandy blonde, had gone mostly gray, cropped short above a square forehead. A neatly trimmed mustache lined his upper lip, and deep-set blue eyes gave him an expression of constant vigilance. Mason had served in law enforcement for 3 decades, and though respected for his fairness, he carried the weary weight of having seen his town touched too often by secrets. His voice was steady, low, with the authority of someone used to command. He entered with 2 deputies, nodding curtly to Daniel and Emma before fixing his gaze on Vance. "What's this man's story?" Mason asked, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the pile of false documents. Daniel explained quickly, his words clipped with anger, how Vance had arrived at the wedding claiming to be forestry service, how he had tried to take Kodiak in the dead of night, how the dog himself had fought to protect them. Mason listened silently, turning the forged badge in his hand. He exhaled slowly. "Not the first time the collective has tried to bury its tracks." Emma's hazel eyes lifted sharply. "So it's true. The Ironwood Collective?" Mason gave a short nod. "We've suspected for years. Illegal logging, smuggling routes through the ridge, bribes slipped to keep eyes closed, but never enough proof to break them apart. He crouched then, resting a hand near Kodiak, careful not to touch without permission. The shepherd sniffed, then relaxed faintly, allowing the sheriff's presence. Mason's blue eyes softened with recognition. "This one," he said quietly. "I remember the reports. Sergeant Kodiak. Declared lost in action during an operation that went wrong. If he survived, he carries more than scars. He carries memory." Clara Jensen slipped into the room then, her green eyes wide but her voice calm. "There's something else," she said, handing Mason the worn map Emma had found in the pouch. The sheriff spread it across the table. The red-marked X sat like a wound in the middle of the drawn forest. Mason's face hardened. "This is one of their staging sites," he muttered, "and if Kodiak was there the night it fell silent, he saw everything." The investigation moved quickly from that point. Deputies followed the trail, guided partly by the map and partly by Harris Claiborne, the veteran whose knowledge of the ridge was unmatched. Harris accompanied the officers into the woods, his tall frame steady despite his age, his pale blue eyes sharp as he retraced old patrol paths. There they found what had been hidden, stashes of illegal timber, a crude encampment abandoned but bearing fresh signs of use. More damning still were the ledgers recovered, records of payments, initials, and dates. Among the names threaded through the documents was one that froze even Mason's steady demeanor. A local councilman, respected in town, who had quietly fed protection to the collective. Word spread through Silver Pines swiftly, shock mingling with vindication. The Ironwood Collective's shadow had loomed for years, whispered of but never confirmed. Now, thanks to a dying dog found on a wedding day, the truth stood bare in the snow. By afternoon, the lodge once more filled with warmth. This time not just for celebration, but for gratitude. Emma sat near the hearth, her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders, her cheeks flushed with both relief and joy. Daniel stood behind her, his broad hand resting on her shoulder, his storm-gray eyes softer now than they had been in days. Kodiak sat between them, his amber gaze calm, wearing a fresh bandage around his neck. Though scarred, though lean, he carried himself with dignity renewed. Guests gathered again, not for music alone, but for the moment that had become larger than vows or rings. Emma rose then, taking Daniel's hand. Together they walked to the front, Kodiak pacing beside them with quiet strength. Clara, with her bright green eyes shining, lifted a camera. Harris, standing in the back, arms folded across his broad chest, gave a solemn nod. Sheriff Mason, still weary but proud, leaned slightly on the doorframe, watching with rare warmth in his pale blue eyes. Emma leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder as Kodiak settled at their side, his muzzle brushing her gown. The shutter clicked, capturing the three of them framed in firelight and snow-dusted windows. A bride, a groom, and the soldier dog who had turned their wedding into something far deeper than celebration. And as the picture was taken, Emma felt a quiet certainty rise in her chest, that love was not only the bond between two people, but the compassion extended to the broken, the forgotten, and the loyal, who still waited for a second chance. In the silence that followed, snow fell gently outside, and in it Emma saw what she could only call grace, a wedding day miracle. Sometimes miracles do not come with thunder or lightning. They come quietly, in the form of a wounded dog found on the coldest day, in the courage of two hearts who chose compassion over comfort. Sergeant Kodiak was not just a survivor, he was a messenger, a reminder that God's hand can reach into even the darkest forests to bring back what was thought forever lost. In our daily lives, we may not face lam tak or hidden conspiracies, but we do face silence, loneliness, and moments where hope feels buried. And just like Emma and Daniel, we are called to stop, to listen, and to love, not only the people closest to us, but also the forgotten lives around us. For it is in those small acts of mercy that heaven's light shines most brightly. If you believe in second chances, if you believe in the quiet miracles of God, then share this story. Leave a comment about where you're watching from, and let us know how faith has touched your journey. Don't forget to subscribe, so together we can keep telling stories that remind us of loyalty, love, and the grace that carries us through every storm. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may His miracles find you in your own everyday life.